Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and this episode should be coming to you either the end of April or the beginning of May. And traditionally, May usually signals the sign of blockbuster season. But of course, this year will be different for obvious reasons that I'm so sick of talking about, I'm not even going to get into it. But hopefully, as we get further and further along and more people start to get vaccinated, we can get somewhat back on the track to normalcy, which would include the film industry returning to somewhat of a normal schedule. Hopefully there won't be many more delays, and everything slated on this year's calendar will premiere as scheduled. So fingers crossed for that happening. But on this episode of the podcast, I am still talking about films that are going to have a bit of a unique release schedule. For instance, the first film I'm talking about is the new Tom Clancy film, Without Remorse, which is set for release exclusively on Amazon Prime Video starting April 30th. And the film stars Michael B. Jordan as a Navy SEAL looking for revenge against the people that murdered his wife. So anything worth Michael B. is in is worth checking out. Then I will be talking about the new film, Percy vs. Goliath, which stars Christopher Walken, Zach Braff, and Christina Ricci. And like most films that aren't based around mind-boggling spectacles and crazy computer-generated effects, this film is based on the true story about a farmer that takes on a major corporation in attempts to save his own farm. And then I will be taking a look at the very gritty drama starring Glenn Close and Mila Kunis, which tackles the issue of opioid addiction. The film is called 4 Good Days, and it shines light on an issue that is really running rampant across the United States. So it should be very interesting to take a look at that film. And in the final segment, I'm going to take a look at the results of the 93rd Academy Awards by breaking down the winners, going over who possibly got snubbed, and other notable events that happened at the film industry's biggest night. So be sure to stick around until the end of the show for that. And while we are on the subject of the Academy Awards, I thought that the films I'll pull from the book 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die should have an Oscar tie-in, so I'm going to talk about the 3 films that hold the record for most Academy Awards won at 11. Pretty understandably, the 3 of them made the book, and they are all movies you must see before you die. And those films are in order: Ben-Hur, Titanic, and The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. They each accomplished this feat in 1959, 1997, and 2003 respectively, with Lord of the Rings making it a clean sweep, winning in all 11 categories it was nominated for, which is all the more impressive when you think it didn't have a single acting nomination. But each one of these films is worthy of its spot in cinema history, whether it's Ben-Hur really revolutionizing the scale at which movies are made, or Titanic for revolutionizing the use of special effects in movies, or Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King for a combination of both those 2 elements. So, I feel it is worth exploring why each of these movies is one you must see before you die. To kick it off, let's start with Ben-Hur, and if you are gonna see this movie, definitely carve out some time to see it. Now, each of these films is incredibly long, but Ben-Hur clocks in at the longest with a runtime of 212 minutes. So if you are going to see this classic epic, definitely set aside an afternoon. But that does nothing to take away from the incredible scope of Ben-Hur, and when you think about it, it is kind of crazy that this film won 11 Academy Awards, and it took 38 years for another film to equal that feat. And not only did this film resonate with the critics, but it was an incredibly successful movie at the time. The production was ultimately conceived in an attempt to duplicate the success of The Ten Commandments, which had come out 3 years prior, which it certainly did, and it came at a very important time for the studio that produced it, MGM, which, as everyone knows now, is one of the biggest production companies on the planet. But at the time, they were really struggling financially, so they really hitched all their success on the film Ben-Hur. Luckily for them, the film was a major success and made icons out of the stars of the film, including Charlton Heston, who is now remembered as one of the most legendary actors of all time, and he plays the titular role of Ben-Hur, a man who is essentially on a path of revenge ever since being framed for an assassination attempt on the Roman Empire, which resulted in him essentially being sent to a slave labor camp. So for anyone interested in checking out the first film to win 11 Academy Awards, check out Ben-Hur. But moving on to the second film to win 11 Academy Awards, this is probably a film a lot of people have already seen, and that is Titanic. This James Cameron epic is also one of the films that holds the record for most Academy Award nominations with 14, and Titanic is one of those rare cases where a film contains both high drama as well as lavish set design. Not only that, but the soundtrack to the film Titanic was incredibly popular, including the hit single by Celine Dion, My Heart Will Go On. The film would go on to gross over $1 billion worldwide, and would cement James Cameron as one of the best directors of all time, as well as Leonardo Dicaprio's status as a Hollywood megastar. And it is always tough making a film where the result is pretty well known, but by centering this story around Kate Winslet's character Rose and DiCaprio's character of Jack, and the budding romance they embark on in their short time together, makes it much more about whether or not these are going to be some of the survivors, or if they are going to be some of the many victims of the most famous shipwreck of all time. And Titanic also has to be thanked for ushering in the new age of Hollywood budgets. The film cost $200 million to make, and at the time, that was the most money ever spent on the production of a movie. To give you an idea of how far we have come, the current record holder for most expensive movie budget of all time is Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides, and that film cost nearly $379 million to make. But as the old saying goes, it's not how much a movie costs, it's how much it makes that's important. But it is crazy to think that it took $200 million to make the movie Titanic, when it took $260 million to produce all 3 Lord of the Rings films. That feat was accomplished by all 3 of them being filmed back to back to back, and the painstaking effort it took to bring J.R.R. Tolkien's fantasy epic to the big screen resulted in the 3rd installment being nominated for 11 Academy Awards and having a spotless record at that year's ceremony, winning everything from Best Picture to Best Visual Effects. The 3rd installment of Peter Jackson's adaptation probably possesses the most unbreakable Oscar record, and that is most wins without any losses. Again, much like Titanic, I don't think there are many people out there that haven't seen the 3rd installment of the Lord of the Rings franchise. But if you have not, definitely make time to see it, because it is one of the rare 3rd installments of a franchise that really delivers on wrapping up the entire story, as well as being able to end on a high note, which is so very hard to do nowadays. So, if you are looking for films that were judged the absolute best top to bottom for pretty much all aspects of filmmaking, take a look at Ben-Hur, Titanic, and Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. Right now, however, I want to shift to the new release, Tom Clancy's Without Remorse, which is set for release April 30th on Amazon Prime Video, and it stars Michael B. Jordan. He is one of the biggest stars working today, so anything he is a part of is worth noting, and it is also worth noting that this is the 8th film adaptation of a work by Tom Clancy. Other notable works adapted to film by the late author have been The Hunt for Red October, Patriot Games, and Clear and Present Danger. But whereas those films all center around the main character of Jack Ryan, this film centers around the character of John Clark. And to give a brief synopsis of the film, John Clark is a part of an elite Navy SEAL group who is captured to start the film, and apparently as a form of retribution, a Russian hit squad finds his pregnant wife, and she is murdered as a result. This sets Michael B. Jordan's character of John Clark on a path of vengeance, as he is out for revenge on anyone who had a hand in his wife's death. So the main character has pretty powerful motivation, and I think Michael B. Jordan is more than up to the challenge of portraying that on screen. And the road to make this film, starring Michael B. Jordan, has been a very long one. Sony Pictures originally bought the rights to the film adaptation of the book for $2.5 million, and the film was originally slated to be released all the way back in 1995. At that point, Michael B. Jordan was 8 years old, so it would have been a little tough for him to convincingly play an elite Navy SEAL. The role was originally slated to go to Keanu Reeves, who was really making a name for himself as the king of the action film in the 90s, but as with many projects, it never got off the ground. It was stuck in development hell, going through many different directors as well as leading actors, with at one point Reeves's Matrix co-star Lawrence Fishburne being penciled in to play John Clark, but it took all the way until 2018 for this Tom Clancy adaptation to finally get off the ground. And Without Remorse is supposed to be the first installment of a series starring the main character of John Clark, as Michael B. Jordan is expected to return in the sequel, Rainbow Six. And if this film is anything like the other Tom Clancy adaptations, it should be filled with a bunch of suspense and a lot of action. But joining Michael B. Jordan in the main cast is actor Guy Pearce, who most people will remember from his starring role in Memento, and he will be playing the Secretary of Defense. Other cast members include Jamie Bell, who is probably best known for his role in Rocketman, where he plays legendary lyricist Bernie Taupin. Other notable actors include Brett Gelman, who is probably best known from his participation in Netflix's Stranger Things, where he plays Murray Bauman, or you could simply recognize him as I do, as that giant bearded actor. Other notable actors include Jack Kesy, who is probably best known for playing Black Tom Cassidy in Deadpool 2, and model Laura London, who will be playing Pam Clark, the slain wife of the protagonist John. So, this film seems like it has a lot to offer. It was filmed in multiple locations, including Berlin and Washington, D.C., as pretty much all works done by Tom Clancy have a tie to the U.S. Capitol in some way. But it will also be interesting to see how Michael B. Jordan performs in the lead role of this film, as he is the first African American to be at the center of a Tom Clancy film. Other notable leading men that have starred in his on-screen adaptations have been people like Alec Baldwin, Harrison Ford, Ben Affleck, Chris Pine, and most recently John Krasinski in Amazon's series about Jack Ryan. So it will be compelling to see what Michael B. Jordan does in this first installment of Tom Clancy's saga surrounding the character John Clark. So for everyone interested in seeing this film, it will be released April 30th on Amazon Prime Video. So if you are a subscriber of Amazon Plus, you will get it no problem. And if you are not, maybe look into becoming a subscriber. You'll get to see the film, plus 2-day shipping. And who doesn't like speedy delivery? But right now, we are going to be taking a quick break on the GSMC movie podcast, but be sure to stick around, because coming up, I will be talking about the new film, Percy vs. Goliath, the film based on a true story about how one man takes on the big farm industry in order to save his own farm and preserve his own livelihood. The film stars Christopher Walken, Zach Braff, and Christina Ricci. Also in the next segment, I will be giving you the box office report as I take a look at which films are slowly but surely starting to breathe a little life into the film industry. And to give you a little preview, there is no stopping Godzilla vs. Kong, which is really not surprising because this film is really more than a giant monkey versus a giant reptile. This is a film essentially 70 years in the making. So it is no big surprise that audiences all over the world and of all sorts of different demographics are responding to it and going to see it in the theater. The ultimate showdown of movie monsters is proving to be an experience audiences really want to see on the big screen. So we will talk a bit more about that film. I'll also give you insights into what other films are performing well and which ones are just absolutely falling on their face, which is always fun to take a look at projects that, to an objective observer, seem as though they would be terrible. Yet, time after time, studios and executives fool themselves into making absolute garbage. So we will be covering all of that in our next segment, but be sure to stick around till the end of the show, as I have the Academy Awards to react to. And to give a little preview on some of the subject I'll be touching on, I have made absolutely no bones about how I think red carpet ceremonies are absolutely pointless television. I can understand the event for the people physically at the ceremony, but of all years when it's limited capacity and very few people are turning up to the red carpet, why in God's name is there a red carpet ceremony at this year's Academy Awards? And the global pandemic aside, I really just think it makes for completely stupid and boring television. The actors and filmmakers are there on what is for most of them the biggest night of their career, if not their life. Adrenaline and nerves are clearly pumping, and they have some dumbass interviewer asking what they're wearing and wasting their time by asking nonsensical questions like, "You've had a big year, haven't you?" I understand they're supposed to be softball questions, but no doy they've had a big year. They're at the Academy Awards, the biggest night the film industry has to offer, and you're wasting their time by saying pointless banter without allowing them to actually say anything of substance. So, we'll be diving into all those fun things that go along with the Academy Awards, and of course we will be getting into the ceremony itself. So stick around, we have all that and more coming up on the GSMC Movie Podcast.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Back into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and in my last segment, I just finished talking about the new film, Tom Clancy's Without Remorse. The film stars Michael B. Jordan, and it follows his character of John Clark, who is out for revenge against a Russian hit squad that murdered his pregnant wife. This is the 8th film adaptation based on a novel by Tom Clancy, with other notable ones being The Hunt for Red October and A Clear and Present Danger. So, if we are judging those by anything to go off of, this film, Without Remorse, should be action-packed, as well as being a very suspenseful thrill ride. Once again, to anybody interested in checking out the film, it will be available for streaming starting Friday, April 30th on Amazon Prime Video. So be sure to keep an eye out for that film, and be sure to keep an eye out for the film Percy vs. Goliath. And the main reason I think this is a film worth noting is the fact that it is based off a true story, which is a court case where a major agricultural corporation sued a small-town farmer, claiming that he stole their formula for seeds. I also think this film is very much worth noting, mainly because it stars Christopher Walken in what may honestly be one of his final roles. He's no spring chicken at 78, and while it really does seem like he's been the same age forever, he may be close to the end of his illustrious film career. He certainly appears to bring his A-game in this film, so for anyone interested in seeing what should be a classic Christopher Walken performance, the film is set for release both in theaters and video on demand starting Friday, April 30th, so I will be diving into the nuts and bolts of that film later on in the segment. Also be sure to stick around till the end of the show, as I'll be reviewing the Academy Awards. But right now, I want to continue the tradition of giving you the box office report. And as I said in the preview of last segment, the undisputed king of the box office right now is Godzilla vs. Kong. The film raked in another $9.5 million, bringing its domestic gross over $82 million, and its worldwide total to $406.5 million. And this movie, of course, is built around the spectacle of a giant CGI gorilla fighting a giant CGI reptile. But this film is really a culmination of a love affair with these two film icons that transcends different generations, languages, and countries. So while it may be a little hollow in terms of substance, I'm very happy to see Godzilla vs. Kong performing so well. One thing I do find fairly surprising is that the total box office for Godzilla vs. Kong isn't even half of what the highest grossing film of the year has been. And that is the film Hi Mom, and it has only been released in international markets. The film has already grossed $822 million without being played in a single theater in the United States, which just further shows you how much the film industry has changed and how financial success in the film industry now means reaching the Asian market. The premise isn't anything super original for Hi Mom. It's essentially the story about a girl going back in time to befriend her mother and better her life. And if that sounds familiar, that's because that is the exact same plot to Back to the Future. I wonder if this one will have a DeLorean in it. But still, you can't argue with its success. $822 million is nothing to sneeze at. But getting back to how the American box office performed last week, Bob Odenkirk's action film Nobody continued to thrive as it brought in over $3.2 million, bringing its running total above $19 million, which for the times we're living in is a pretty good number. And who knows, maybe he'll get the John Wick treatment where he gets a bunch of sequels and has another chance to make a lot of box office with this property. But Nobody is still holding firm at the number 2 spot at the domestic box office. Also holding steady is the number 3 film, The Unholy. This religious horror film made another $2.6 million, which brings its running domestic total above $10 million, which again just proves that there is something about horror films. There's always going to be an audience for these types of movies, which is why The Unholy has been in the top 3 in terms of domestic box office generated since it has debuted, and falling just outside of the top 3, but holding fast to its number 4 spot at the box office is Raya and the Last Dragon. And I have talked a lot about this film, so I won't really belabor the point, but I still think it's impressive that Raya and the Last Dragon is able to put up the box office numbers that it is, when people could easily just watch the movie at home through Disney Premium Access. So congratulations to Raya and the Last Dragon for continuing to perform well at the box office. And rounding out the top 5 is a film that managed to edge its way back into the top 5 is the Tom and Jerry movie. It just edged out Voyagers by raking in $1.3 million, which I think is rather impressive given that this film has been in theaters for going on 3 months. So congrats to the Tom and Jerry film, which brings its running total to $42 million. And tough break for Voyagers, which falls just outside the top 5, despite having a fairly original concept and a pretty terrific young cast. But that film may just be aimed at a target market that isn't going to the theater right now. And there is one more film I want to talk about. It was the 7th highest grossing film at the box office last week. And the reason I've neglected to talk about it up until this point is just because the premise is so ridiculous. It sounds like something that would be a straight-to-video release from the 1990s, and that is the film The Girl That Believes in Miracles. This is a religious-based film where there is a young girl who apparently prays to God, and he answers all the prayers. And these miracles range from bringing animals back to life to helping a paralyzed child walk again. It is an incredibly cheesy premise, but I guess it just goes to show how open the general public is to feel-good stories at the moment. So I thought it was worth mentioning the film The Girl Who Believes in Miracles. when you consider that this film is outperforming The Courier, which stars Benedict Cumberbatch, which is just a really weird thing to say. But that will pretty much do it for the box office report. And to everyone who is going to the movie theaters, I hope you're being safe, but I gotta say thank you for breathing life back into an industry which sorely needs it. And hopefully the next film I'm talking about will help breathe some life back into the theater industry as well. And that is a film that apparently is going by a couple different names. It is being titled simply Percy, but we're going to go with the title Percy versus Goliath, which is based on the true story of farmer Percy Schmeiser and a court battle he was involved in against Monsanto, which is a very large agricultural company. They are now owned by Bayer, but back in 1997 they sued Schmeiser because they believed he was using their patented plant cells to grow canola beans. Schmeiser denied these claims, and without spoiling too much about the story, this case really became a landmark one in terms of independent farmers' rights versus big corporations. And what was ultimately being argued in this court case was that Monsanto had a patent over essentially the DNA of a specific seed, and they were trying to argue that that genetic code could not be duplicated without a farmer paying them royalties, which I have to say is one of the stupidest things I have ever heard of. I'm fully behind the idea of patenting a piece of intellectual property, an invention you've made, copyrighting a piece of music you've written so you're fairly compensated for the work that you've put into something. But when a company is trying to patent the genetic code of a living organism, that should really be the boundary of what you are allowed to copyright and patent and what you are not allowed to should come into play, because that's essentially the idea of a restaurant being able to sue someone for cooking something at their own home on the grounds of an individual using a similar recipe. That's essentially McDonald's being allowed to sue someone for making a double cheeseburger with 3 pieces of bread because it follows the same formula as a Big Mac. And I know that's not a perfect analogy because patents in the agricultural world are a lot more complicated, as I've learned from researching this film a little bit, but the idea that you are allowed to own the genetic code to something is beyond ridiculous in my mind. But this was a real court case, and Schmeiser had to plead his case before the Supreme Court of Canada and prove that he in no way stole the patent Monsanto had, in addition to arguing that a farmer has a right to do whatever they want to on their land, as long as that is within the law, of course. And not to give too much away about the film itself, but the subject matter is pretty compelling, because while this film is set in Canada, the story very much translates to the United States, and how very few people think about where their food actually comes from. There has been a push in recent years to have more farm-to-table distribution systems, but the vast majority of this country doesn't spare a second thought about where their food comes from. It is really just taken for granted that it shows up at the supermarket. And this film is really attempting to shed light on something that, while the majority of people just expect food to show up in the supermarket, there are people out there where their entire livelihood revolves around crop production. And as with any industry, if big corporations are allowed to just set up a monopoly, that destroys competition and essentially destroys the free market. And while it does seem like there are a lot of films right now criticizing capitalism as a system in general, I think this film is really just criticizing the dirtier aspects of capitalism and just arguing for there to be an actually competitive marketplace without allowing major corporations to make it impossible for independent, in this case, farmers, make a living and maintain their business. And I know that there is a lot of discourse in America right now over capitalism versus socialism, but I think this film will just have a nice message of there being a level playing field for everyone to play on and make a living off of. And so far, this film is drawing major critical praise. It did debut in Canada all the way back in October of last year, and it is only now making its way to the American theaters. But since its debut back in October, the film has garnered a 91% on Rotten Tomatoes from the critics. It has scored a 6.8 out of 10 from IMDb, and a lot of people are praising the performance of Christopher Walken, which I have to say is probably the thing I liked most about researching this film. Christopher Walken has been a staple in the film industry ever since the 1960s. He's turned in some truly iconic performances in Deer Hunter and Catch Me If You Can, while also expanding his range, appearing in more comedic films like Wedding Crashers and Click. And while I did say earlier that he must be close to the end of his career, it's still great to see that he is able to deliver such a powerhouse performance. So if you are a fan of Christopher Walken, this movie will be worth seeing solely on that front. But to give you an idea of who is joining him in this film, I mentioned earlier that Zach Braff is also featured in Percy vs. Goliath, and while he is most definitely best known for playing the lovable goofball JD on the show Scrubs, he has proven over his career that he is more than capable of tackling dramatic roles, as proven in films like Garden State. The film also stars Christina Ricci, who herself has had a pretty illustrious career, evolving from a child star, where she was in films like the 1995 Casper the Ghost movie, and since then has really grown into a pretty good actress. One thing she starred in recently was the Lizzie Borden Chronicles, where she played the titular axe murderer. But hopefully in this film, she doesn't have to draw on any experiences from that role. But besides those main three, the rest of the cast is lined with veteran actors that all seem up to the task of doing justice to this pretty unbelievable true story. And once again, for those of you who are interested in viewing the film Percy vs. Goliath, it will be hitting theaters nationwide, as well as being available via video on demand, starting on Friday, April 30th. So to all of you who are a fan of the true underdog story, be sure to check out Percy vs. Goliath. Right now, however, I'm going to take a quick break on the GSMC movie podcast, but be sure to stick around because coming up in our next segment, I will be giving you the GSMC movie podcast news report, where I go over new announcements and different stories that pertain to the film industry. And I will also be taking a look at the new film, 4 Good Days, which stars Glenn Close and Mila Kunis, which is a film that takes a close look at an opioid addict trying to get clean and really struggling with the effects of withdrawals. And obviously the opioid epidemic is a major issue in the country at the moment, and there are starting to be major motion pictures about this issue featuring major Hollywood stars. For those of you who listen to this podcast regularly, you may remember I talked about the film Cherry starring Tom Holland. That film was also about someone struggling with an opioid addiction to the point where they were robbing banks to feed their addiction. This film, 4 Good Days, seems to be focused on the struggles it takes to get clean, but nonetheless should offer a very immersive viewing experience and shed some light on a very serious issue. So stick around, we'll be talking about that film. And in our last segment, we're going to be talking about the Academy Awards, reacting to the winners and some of the significant moments from the 93rd annual Oscars, including Daniel Kaluuya making his mother cringe, how Regina King really can't read a room when she's speaking publicly, and I will be putting my own Oscar picks under the microscope. I was just under 50%, going 11 for 23. And the most annoying aspect of that is in categories where I thought it was really between 1 or 2 films. The winner in a vast majority of those categories ended up being my second choice. But all in all, I think this year's Academy Awards was a good night for the film industry, and we'll be dissecting all of that coming up on the GSMC Movie Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and in my last segment, I wrapped up talking about the new film, Percy vs. Goliath, which stars Christopher Walken, and tells the real-life story of an independent farmer that was sued by the Monsanto Agriculture Company because they believe he stole one of their patents. This was a real case that took place in Canada, and now it is getting the big screen treatment. It did debut in Canada all the way back in October, but it is now making its way to American theaters, as well as being available on video on demand starting April 30th. So if you are interested in a true underdog story, as well as a fan of legal drama, in addition to seeing Christopher Walken turn in a powerhouse performance, be sure to check out Percy vs. Goliath. And to give you a preview of what we will be talking about in this segment, I'll be diving into the new film, 4 Good Days, which stars Glenn Close and Mila Kunis, and it takes a look at someone going through withdrawals and trying to get clean in hopes of kicking their opioid addiction. This will be the second time I focus on a film where the main character is dealing with an opioid addiction. For regular listeners, you may remember me talking about the film Cherry, which is directed by the Russo brothers and stars Tom Holland, where he plays someone who is going to the extreme lengths of robbing banks in order to feed their addiction. This film, 4 Good Days, seems to be taking a different approach and focusing on a different aspect of addiction, but nonetheless, I think it's going to be a very immersive and compelling film. And be sure to stick around until the end of the show, as I do have the Academy Awards to respond to, where I'll go over the winners, as well as talking about some memorable moments from the 93rd Annual Academy Awards, including Glenn Close doing something that not many 74-year-old women are likely to do. But all in all, I think the Academy Awards was a good night, despite how untraditional it was. The main purpose of the ceremony was still achieved, and that is recognizing great filmmaking, great acting, and paying tribute to all the work that went into creating these captivating stories. So I will be diving into all of that in our next segment. But right now, I want to bring you another installment of the GSMC Movie Podcast News Report. I am going to steer clear of news as it relates to the Oscars, as we'll get into all of that next segment. So this will strictly be new announcements in the film industry, and I guess I'll start with what has come to dominate the movie industry, and that is superhero films. It was announced recently that the standalone Flash film has started filming. This comic book movie will have Ezra Miller reprising his role as the titular Flash, but one fairly surprising announcement that came along with this news is that Michael Keaton is going to be reprising his role of Batman in the film. Now, I'm sure his involvement in the film will be more of a wink towards the audience, considering that Robert Pattinson is now slated to play the Dark Knight. So I just have this feeling that Michael Keaton's appearance will be more of a meta joke to the audience, with it being somewhat related to the Flash's ability to travel between timelines and different dimensions. But either way, seeing Michael Keaton play Batman for the first time in almost 30 years should be interesting to see. And it will be nice to see someone who did a lot to legitimize comic book films have another shot at inhabiting the character he, in a lot of ways, put on the map when it came to feature-length films. But whatever his involvement is, it'll be interesting to see him in this new Flash film, which is scheduled to be released November 4th of 2022. So mark your calendars for that. But sticking on the topic of superhero films, because those seem to be the films with the most abundant news related to them, there is apparently a 4th Captain America film in the works. The head writer and executive producer of the Disney Plus series Falcon and the Winter Soldier has confirmed that he is currently developing a 4th installment for the beloved franchise for Disney Studios. There is still a lot to be sorted out with this project, least of all who is going to be playing Captain America, given that Chris Evans stepped away from the role after donning the Stars and Stripes in 7 different Marvel films, and who will be directing this 4th installment, given that the Russo brothers likewise have stepped away from the MCU. But much like a sports team, the pieces may change, but the overall franchise still has to plug on. And however it shakes out with this fourth Captain America film, it is going to be interesting, as this is the first time pretty much since the MCU's conception where they're going to have to recast a major character. They did recast Edward Norton and Terrence Howard, but those were characters in the very first installments of the MCU, and at that point, absolutely nobody had any idea what it was going to grow into. And it is going to be interesting to see what direction the MCU goes in from here. Most of their recent productions, and those slated to come out in the future, have revolved around really providing closure to the audiences. The obvious example was Avengers Endgame, but we can also take a look at the upcoming Black Widow film, as well as the next Thor film, Thor Love and Thunder, and how those films are going to provide natural jumping off points for these characters, which makes their new releases, Shang-Chi, as well as the Eternal films that are to be released later this year, all the more important as they are supposed to be shouldering the load of the MCU moving forward. But really the key takeaway from the MCU right now is there is going to be a fourth Captain America film, so that should be very interesting. And while I did say that I was going to steer clear of Oscar news, this next piece of news is a bit of quasi-Oscar news, because Leonardo DiCaprio is actually going to be producing a remake and essentially an American adaptation of the film that won Best International Feature Film, and that was Another Round. So DiCaprio has acquired the adaptation rights he will be producing, and it is very possible he is going to be starring in the film as well. And for those who are unaware, Another Round is a story about four middle-aged men who essentially go on a beer mile, shedding all responsibilities and inhibitions to simply have fun. So it will be interesting to see what DiCaprio does adapting that story for an American audience. But moving on to a few other pieces of film industry news. Apparently, Downton Abbey is going to be getting a sequel that is slated to come this Christmas. And I have to be honest, I just don't understand what story is left to be told here. How many times can you see a story about British people being fussy and still find it interesting? But whatever. I guess I shouldn't complain if Maggie Smith is going to get work. So that movie is going to get made, and it has also been announced that Kristen Wiig and Annie Mumlo are going to be developing a spin-off of Cinderella featuring the stepsisters. So that should be interesting to take a look at characters that at one point were viewed as villains, which is fairly prevalent with Disney nowadays, as the Cruella de Vil movie is set for release May 28th. And I think I will close out this installment of the GSMC Movie Podcast News Report with a bit of a lighthearted film announcement, and that is that Vin Diesel is slated to be a part of a live-action Rock'em Sock'em Robots movie. And I just want that concept to sink in for a moment. There is going to be a live-action adaptation of a game that essentially is just two figures and four buttons that make them punch each other. But leave it to Vin Diesel to make this into a movie. He's also the man that said that Fast 7 was going to be nominated for an Oscar. Sorry, check that. He said that Fast 7 was going to win the Oscar for Best Picture. So who knows what expectations he has for this film. It is reported that they want to get this film made quickly, mostly because Vin Diesel still has two Fast and Furious films to work on, and I just don't understand how there is still a demand for those movies. Like, I understand people wanting to see souped up cars and chase scenes, but how many times can you see the same characters talking about them being a family before that formula gets stale? But who knows, if Vin Diesel can make a franchise based around a bunch of gearheads work, maybe he can make a franchise based around the Rock'em Sock'em Robots work. So, we will have to see how that plays out, but that is pretty much going to do it for this installment of the GSMC Movie Podcast News Report. Moving on, we are going to get to our feature film of the segment, and that is the new film, 4 Good Days, which stars Glenn Close and Mila Kunis. And to give a brief synopsis, Kunis plays a character with an opioid addiction, and she is seeking treatment, or is more accurately being forced to seek treatment, and this treatment will be a shot that essentially prevents her from getting high. The only catch, in order to receive the treatment, she has to be sober for 7 days prior to receiving the injection. The character of Molly has been sober for 3 days, but she is not keen on the idea of staying sober for 4 more. But that is what the movie is going to focus on and where it gets the title from. 4 Good Days, which is definitely a cynical title, as we are going to be focusing on this character's addiction and how she is going to deal with withdrawals. And Glenn Close's character of Deb is going to be the representation of a family member or loved one that has to support someone dealing with the addiction. And I'm sure it's going to be a very captivating performance when you are playing someone who has the best interest of a loved one at heart, but they essentially hate you for it because you are preventing them from fulfilling a need that is at that point a compulsion. So while Mila Kunis's character, Molly, is going to be dealing with the most obvious struggle of the film and the most visual, Glenn Close's character of Deb is really going to be going through an internal struggle where she is going to have to grapple with the behavior of her loved one while still hoping that this person is merely under the spell of some toxic influence and their real character is still somewhere underneath all that. And this film is really hoping to do a lot in terms of shedding light on the issue that is the opioid epidemic. And I think that casting someone like Mila Kunis in this role, because she is someone the audience really loves from her being a part of the mainstream since she was 14 when she started on That 70s Show. And because of that, she is going to be a character that will elicit a lot of sympathy and possibly cause some people to reconsider their whole outlook on addiction as being more than people making poor decisions. And I do find it interesting that this film is coming out now because that does coincide with the release of a book called Kingpins, which takes a look at the Sackler family, which are the owners of Purdue Pharma, which produces OxyContin. And while the whole opioid epidemic is not as simple as just pointing to one person, or in this case a family, and saying it's all their fault, this family did do a lot of lobbying to make it very easy for people to get OxyContin and make it one of the painkillers that is most often prescribed when someone has had a surgery. And if you take a deeper dive into the stats surrounding when people first are exposed to opioids, there are 2 major life events that are usually behind this, and that is when people get their wisdom teeth out and when they have had an injury from high school sports. Now, both of those events take place mainly when people are in their formative teenage years, and at that point in their life, it's not really a conscious decision on whether or not they're going to be taking an opioid in the first place. It is something that is being advised by doctors and, quite honestly, by their parents. So because of this, a lot of people are getting their first exposure to opioids by trusting in people that are supposed to have their best interests at heart. And because this exposure comes at such a young age, they are much more susceptible and much more likely to develop an addiction because of this. And I'm sure there are more accurate stats out there, but it really is a flip of a coin on whether or not someone's going to be addicted. In my own personal life, I had OxyContin prescribed after I had my wisdom teeth out. I took it due to the intense pain, and really the only side effect I really noticed was that they would put me to sleep right away. I didn't end up using all of the pills, but from what I can remember, my recovery time was slated between 4 and 6 days. Yet I was given a prescription for a full month of pills. So with a highly addictive drug being prescribed to people in such mass quantities, most often during a point in someone's life when they are incredibly impressionable and their brain chemistry hasn't fully developed, it's not as simple as just saying that person has made a poor life decision and they're responsible for the situation they have gotten themselves into. So hopefully this film, 4 Good Days, is not only going to be an entertaining one, but also has moments that people can learn from. So for anyone interested in checking out the film 4 Good Days, it stars Glenn Close, Mila Kunis, and Stephen Root. It will be available in theaters on a limited basis starting Saturday, May 1st, and will be available via video on demand starting May 21st. So to anyone interested, I do recommend you check out 4 Good Days. Right now, however, we are going to be taking our last break on the GSMC movie podcast, but be sure to stick around for our next segment as we are going to be dissecting the Academy Awards. And while I do think the ceremony was a good night for the film industry as a whole, the ratings for the event tell a different story. as they were down nearly 60% from last year. So in addition to talking about the winners and losers, as well as notable moments from the night, I'm going to take a look at that and speculate on what the possible causes of that could have been. And just to give a bit of a preview as to possibly why the ratings were down, maybe having 2-hour-long pre-shows turned audiences off. Like, I understand the red carpet is a staple of award shows. I understand why it is a big deal for people attending the event. I see absolutely no reason to televise the event, though. But on top of that, having another hour-long pre-show called Oscar in the Spotlight or whatever it was, which was clearly just a way to grab more ad revenue. But whoever is producing these events has to understand the media landscape that we now live in. If people aren't captivated by a pre-show and the event itself is just hours of introductions and acceptance speeches, they have to know people can just look up the results online and all the major moments from the event are going to go viral regardless of how many people tune in. You really have to be more dynamic with how you're presenting this event and how you are connecting with your desired audience. So we'll get into all that, as well as all other notable moments from the Academy Awards on the next segment of the GSMC Movie Podcast, so don't go anywhere.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
And welcome back into the fourth and final segment of the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Rich McDonough, and in my last segment, I finished talking about the new film, 4 Good Days, which takes a look at opioid addiction. The film stars Mila Kunis as an addict attempting to get clean so she can undergo treatment, and she is aided by Glenn Close, who plays her caregiver. The film is set for release May 1st and will hopefully do a lot to shed some light on the opioid epidemic and provide people with a little bit of perspective on what it's like to deal with an addiction and go through withdrawals. So to anyone interested, I highly recommend you check out 4 Good Days. But shifting gears from an upcoming film to our main topic of the biggest night in the film industry, and I of course am going to be talking about the 93rd Annual Academy Awards. Taking place last Sunday, this unique version of the Oscars honored excellence in filmmaking, and despite the ratings being way down from previous years, which I will get into a little bit later, I think overall it was a pretty good night for the film industry. But I have to start by saying that I did not do as well as I thought I would on my picks for who is going to win each Academy Award. I went 11 for 23, and the most frustrating thing about this is categories where I thought it was going to be a 2-horse race. I, in most cases, picked the wrong horse. But one of the categories I did get correct was Best Picture, which was won by Nomadland, which probably had the most unique moment in an acceptance speech where Frances McDermott howled like a wolf, but this film was obviously deserving, and Nomadland actually walked away with the most Oscars on the night with 3, which was short of the 5 I think I predicted they would win, but I was correct in guessing that the film's director, Chloe Zhao, would be the recipient of the Best Director award. She becomes only the second female director to ever win the award, joining Kathleen Bigelow, who won it in 2009 for directing The Hurt Locker, which is all the more impressive when you take a look at how this is only the third feature-length film that she has directed. So congratulations to Chloe Zhao, but she doesn't have much time to savor the win, as she is slated to direct the upcoming Marvel movie, The Eternals, which brings me to the third award that the movie Nomadland won on the night, and that was for Frances McDermott winning Best Leading Actress. This marks the third time in her career that she has won this honor, and while I did say that she had one of the most memorable moments of the night, when she howled like a wolf when the production team was accepting the award for Best Picture, her acceptance speech when she was accepting this award was very controlled and spoke of optimism for the film industry, imploring people to get back to theaters when it is safe to do so. So congratulations to Frances McDermott for winning her third Academy Award for Best Leading Actress. Which brings me to the next category, which is Best Leading Actor. This was won by Anthony Hopkins, which I truly believe was an upset over Chadwick Boseman, both because of the incredible performance he turned in Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, but also because I thought that there was just so much sentiment behind him this year. He was going to quote-unquote receive a career Oscar. But upset or not aside, I can't really say that Anthony Hopkins was undeserving of the award. He turned in a terrific performance in The Father. I really just wish that he was there and able to give an acceptance speech. But given that he is 83, it is more than understandable. He didn't want to put himself in an environment where he could possibly put his health at risk. But congratulations to Anthony Hopkins on winning his second Academy Award. And everyone will obviously remember what he won his first one for, where he played the immensely iconic movie villain Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. And here he is, almost 30 years later, setting a record for being the oldest actor to ever win an Oscar. So congratulations to Sir Anthony Hopkins. But moving on to the next category, which was Best Supporting Actor, and this winner was never really in doubt, and that, of course, was Daniel Kaluuya for his powerhouse performance in Judas and the Black Messiah. He has pretty much swept every major award category for Best Supporting Actor, and provided one of the night's most memorable moments, where he channeled his inner Jeff Bridges and started talking about how wonderful it is to be alive. But he would go one step further and explain the process as to how he became alive in the first place. During his speech, he actually said the line, "My mom and my dad had sex," and his mother was in attendance. And the camera did a wonderful job capturing her reaction, and she looked absolutely mortified. So thank you, Daniel Kaluuya, for providing that amazing Oscar moment, and congratulations on your win for Best Supporting Actor. But moving on to the final acting category, which is Best Supporting Actress, and this category was also subject to another historic first, and that was Yeon Yoo-jung, becoming the first actress of Korean descent to win an Academy Award for acting. This, of course, was for her role in Minari, and she gave one of the funnier acceptance speeches and had a nice back and forth with Brad Pitt. So congratulations to Yeon Yoo-jung for winning the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. But moving right along into the script categories, Promising Young Woman took home the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, while The Father took home the Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay. And with these two categories, it's always interesting to see who the Academy rewards for having the best screenplays, because it is rather tough to tell what is great writing and what is great acting enhancing so-so writing. But the Academy clearly felt that Promising Young Woman and The Father each were deserving of recognition, so congratulations to those two films. But moving right along, the Christopher Nolan film Tenet won Best Visual Effects, and this film really was shouldering the load last year as far as getting audiences in theaters. It was one of the only films in theaters and one of the only draws to bring people into them. So it's nice to see that it got recognized for its efforts, even if I do jokingly refer to it as the feature-length Boomerang Post. But all in all, Tenet was deserving, and I'm not really sure what I was thinking with my pick of the one and only Ivan. But moving on from the film that won for Best Visual Effects to movies that are simply raw storytelling, and I of course am speaking of documentaries, the winner for Best Documentary Feature was My Octopus Teacher. This film really picked up steam heading into the Academy Awards, and it tells the story of the year that scuba diver Craig Foster spent free-diving off the South African coast, and the very unique relationship he formed with an octopus that would constantly find him during his filming. And to anyone interested in checking out that documentary, it is now available on Netflix. But moving on to the winner for Best Documentary Short, this was the short film Colette, which tells the story of a Holocaust survivor returning to the concentration camp where her brother died. It tells a very evocative and powerful story, and it also set a record for being the first film produced by a video game company to both be nominated and win an Academy Award. And this short was a co-production of Respawn Entertainment with Oculus by Facebook. So, all sorts of history being made at this year's Oscars. So, moving on to the other short film categories, the winner of Best Live Action Short Film was Two Distant Strangers, and given what has been such a major topic in the news over the past year, it's not a real surprise that this film was the winner in this category, as this production tells the story of a young black man who is caught in a time loop, which always ends with his death at the hands of the police. So this category recognized a little bit of art imitating life. But moving on to the Best Animated Short Film, the winner in this category was In Case Anything Happens, I Love You, which also dealt with pretty serious subject matter, especially for an animated short, as it told the story of two parents having to grapple with the loss of their daughter, who was killed in a school shooting. This animated short film told a very powerful message and was very deserving of this award. And in one of the more powerful acceptance speeches was given by Thomas Vettenberger when he was accepting the award for Best International Film, as he was the producer of The Winner, Another Round. But in his speech, he gave a very moving tribute to his daughter, Ida, who unfortunately passed away before she had a chance to be in the film, as she was tragically killed by someone who was texting while driving. Now, there is nothing that can compensate for losing a child, but congratulations to Wittenberger for being recognized on his filmmaking ability. And as I stated in the previous segment, this film, Another Round, is going to be adapted by Leonardo Dicaprio. But moving right along, we are going to get into the audio awards, and I'm going to start with Best Song, which was won by Fight For You by the artist Her, which was from the film Judas and the Black Messiah. And for all of those interested in hearing what the Academy Award winner for Best Song sounds like, go check it out on whichever platform you get your music off of. Moving on to the other audio awards, the film Soul won for Best Original Score, and it would also win for Best Animated Feature. And for this film, those two elements were incredibly intertwined in making the film as good as it was. So congratulations to everyone at Pixar who made Soul the amazing film that it was. And getting to our final category, based around the sound of a film, which is fittingly Best Sound Editing. This, of course, was won by the heavy favorite, The Sound of Metal, which most likely won this award in no short part due to the fact that this tells the story of a musician who is losing their hearing. And the sound editing in this film was much more than just making sure it lined up with visuals on screen. It really did a lot to help the audience identify with the character on screen. But that is not to say that The Sound of Metal's visuals weren't up to snuff, as they also won in the category for Best Film Editing. So congratulations to The Sound of Metal for winning 2 Academy Awards on the night. Another film that won 2 Academy Awards was Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, winning in the categories of Best Makeup and Hairstyling, as well as Best Costume Design. Both wins, I would say, are well-deserved, as when you are making a film about jazz singers in the 1930s, there's a lot that goes into making their looks both authentic as well as visually interesting. So congratulations to the production design teams of Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. They were not, however, able to make it a clean sweep in those categories, as the film Mank Mank won for Best Production Design. And this film also had to tell a story set in a different time period. So once again, authenticity was a big factor in selecting a winner. But I really do think the Academy has a soft spot for any film that reminds them of the good old days of Hollywood, which I think was a contributing factor to Mank winning in this category, as well as them winning in the category of Best Cinematography. But I can see why Mank scored a victory in this category, as this film was not only set in the 1930s and 40s, but it was really made to feel as though it was made in the 1930s and 40s. So in order to have the final product appear as though it was made in that time period, a lot of work had to be put in during the filming process, deciding on which cameras to use and how different scenes in the film were blocked. So congratulations to the team that made Mank. Even though it may be a little disappointing to have been nominated for 10 Academy Awards and only walk away with 2 wins, it's good to win anything. So there you have them, the winners at the 93rd Annual Academy Awards. Some other notable moments from the night were when Bryan Cranston presented the Jean Hersholt Humanitarian Award to the Motion Picture and Television Fund, which is an association that helps actors who have fallen on hard times. And this year there were 2 recipients of the award, the other being Tyler Perry, who gave a very heartfelt speech. Other than that, I think I've touched on most of the other notable moments from the night, but some others were Harrison Ford reading a pretty negative review of Blade Runner when he was introducing the category for Best Film Editing. And possibly the most bizarre moment of the night is when Glenn Close, who by the way is 74 years old, was asked to twerk, and she obliged. Say what you want, but that woman is an entertainer. All in all, I thought the award ceremony was a positive night, but if you take a look at the ratings, it was one of the worst in Oscar history. This year's ceremony was down almost 60% in viewership from last year. And the most likely culprit for that, obviously, is the pandemic. Most theaters were closed. A lot of people weren't able to go see the nominees in theaters, so they weren't as invested in the results this year. There were also a lot of new faces being nominated for Academy Awards, especially on the acting side. So a lot of actors being nominated that audiences aren't that familiar with may have contributed to the lack of ratings. But in my personal opinion, I really do think that having 2 hours worth of pre-shows really doesn't help when you're trying to sell an event as a major spectacle worth investing in. The red carpet and all that pre-show stuff started at 6:30, with the ceremony running pretty much through midnight, and it is incredibly hard to get an audience invested in something for close to 6 hours. It reminds me of the phrase, pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered, and by that I mean if you make too much content about a specific event, you're not enhancing it or making it feel more epic, you're devaluing the things that are actually worth viewing. So I really believe that the pre-shows and how much of a sideshow they've really become was a contributing factor in the ratings dip for this year's Academy Awards. So it will be interesting to see what the Academy does next year to prevent a similar event from happening. But all in all, I do think the night was a good one for the film industry, and congratulations to all the winners. But that will pretty much do it for me here on the GSMC Movie Podcast. Once again brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network, and I do want to thank everyone who is listening to this podcast. It really means a lot. If you have not already, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you're always notified when a new episode is released. And if you could leave us a nice review, those really help us a lot. And be sure to follow us on our social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. That is it for me, Rich McDonough, and I will see you next time on the GSMC Movie Podcast.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.